Right. Last panel of the day, and thank you guys for all hanging around and staying around. And we'll open it up to the floor pretty quickly, so because we would like to hear your views as well on this issue. And welcome to our panelists. Would you like to give yourself a quick introduction? Like we've seen you all throughout the show, but I think just
let's start ladies first.
Thank you. So Alix, Rousselière, senior consultant with Novaspace. I was just up, so I'll keep this very short. I'm in charge of our ground segment market report, and we're basically a strategy consulting and market intelligence firm.
Yeah, you've heard from me a fair bit. Laurence Russell with Data Center Dynamics. I've worked for a number of people over my 6-year career. Perhaps a younger voice than you're used to, but I've been covering it for some time. I've got some clear understanding, and I suppose just here for a more informal view. It's not common to see journalists on these sorts of panels, but a bit experimental.
Very good. I'm Jake Saunders, VP Managing Director at ABI Research. I was on yesterday. I think my ink is very fresh, so I'll just add it at last minute. So I've not done any swatting up with a particular slot, but I'll do my best. Based in Singapore. Run a SATCOM team out of Singapore, but also cover the issues around telcos, cellular, so I might also bring in some of those perspectives as well into today's discussion.
And I've just thrown my notes away because...
Gone brave.
No, it was kind of like, what I hear today is almost like contradicted everything. You know, I've been listening to, thinking what was going to happen, you know, in the defense and the military side. And there's just a different feel about the word sovereignty. And I don't know if you guys out there have noticed, but it gets banded around so much now in different forms. And it's normally kind of not so much those people who are purchasing the systems. It's those guys who are doing the selling, or those who are doing the planning and things. And I first came across the real issue with the word, I'd say 5-6 years ago. We were doing conferences down in Australia, and they had a project called JP1907 or JP9107. I can't remember which one it was. And we were putting on conferences very similar to this. And so we get the defense along, you know, all the satellite manufacturers are down, the ground segment, and we're all down there. And they were going to do these big bid sessions for this contract, and then the Australian companies kind of said this needs to be sovereign, because they wanted to build the satellites, they wanted to do this and that. And of course they couldn't build the satellites because they didn't have the experience, so they got some primes, and then these bids went in, and with the word sovereignty was so vocal, you know, it just kept coming and coming and coming and coming. And Lieutenant Colonel Clifford White, one of the defense guys on the project, he became so frustrated he even went on the government website and gave a definition of what sovereignty was. But there's still sovereignty, sovereignty. And now we're here in Europe and across the world, and you know, sovereignty again is right on our radar. And much of it was down to, I'd say it was these new systems that everyone was implementing, but then there was word that Starlink could be switched off, you know, and And then the alarm bells went ringing, and everyone wanted, you know, to push that sovereignty right out there. And what does it mean to each nation? Nations became more, you know, nationalistic, but in the event, if you want to have a sovereign satellite system, LEO is going to be the big problem, I would say, to actually do that. So we're here today to have a little bit of discussion, what the market can deliver, what the defense and the nations, you know, can achieve, you know, and you know, what will enable them to do that. And I said earlier, you know, we had Dan Goldberg from Light Squared, you know, Telesat, you know, basically saying he can sell a sovereign system to the EU while Iris Squared has been rolled out. Now his idea of a sovereign system, as far as I can make out, is you can run data, all the system across his system, and you can control all that data, but you're not going to be controlling the satellites and da, 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 da. So in effect, it's yours, but he still owns the hardware up there in space. So over to you, Jake. What's your feelings about it?
Yes, I mean, it's a very complex issue. I mean, I, like yourself, started to see this becoming on my particular radar about the same time. We started to see this in the telco sphere with 4G, 5G, and then telcos wanting to integrate sort of telco cloud. And where is that cloud going to be? You know, is it, you know, if you're a Singtel or in Singapore or Australia, you know, is it Telstra? So started to butt up against those sort of challenges. But again, it's just a very, very complex scenario. And of course, it goes against the headwinds of the last 20 to 30 years where we built up momentum behind globalization, and that streamlined and in trying to bring down the cost of services and products and everything. So I think there's going to have to be some complexity as what is sovereignty mean to you? You know, is it everything from the full value stack, from hardware terminals, satellites, the gateways, the network operations center, even the cloud? And I think there's multi-layers to it. So what do you do? I think there's a lot of issues.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because I suppose the question around what are you doing sovereignty for comes down to what is going to catch you with the pants down. You know, we had that moment, that very infamous point at September 2022, where the Starlink service was turned off. I suppose that was essentially the reason why all that conversation had been going. And I had a long conversation with Dan Goldberg about sovereignty, and he echoed those same remarks, consistently believing that what he had was authentically sovereign for Europe. I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, on the first day, we had a very, very interesting breakdown, this sort of pyramid of sovereignty, of what are we talking about exactly? Are we talking about you're working on the metal going in the first place? Is all of the jobs from on your own shores, or are we talking about a service that you happen to run where none of the technology has actually been processed where you are? It's a huge conversation. I think that it is to some extent political. I think sometimes there's some economic dimension, but as I mentioned, ultimately it boils down to when is this going to catch you out? How is it going to catch you out? What is it going to take away from you that you specifically bought in for? And maybe we'll find out exactly what that looks like in the next few years, because I think that the real conversation around sovereignty is it might not be possible for every single country in the world to build their own infrastructure. I think that we are going to still have to rely on each other, perhaps for the better.
Yeah, definitely a very complex and nuanced topic. I forget if it was Barry or Peter this morning who said, ask 3 different people and you get 5 different answers to what sovereignty means. I really liked that. I think it encapsulates the complexity. You also touched upon the remark yesterday of Mark with the pyramid, the layers of sovereignty. I think overall, when you take a step back, sovereignty used to really mean owning control over the entire value chain. But to your point, how much of that is realistic? You have semiconductors. I think this was also mentioned in a conversation earlier. Does this mean that down to your semiconductors, you're going to be controlling, the chips? That seems very improbable, very costly. I think now we're moving away from this kind of binary notion. It's either sovereign, not sovereign. We're looking at layers. Completely in agreement with what you just said on, vulnerability. What is that critical element that would really compromise you? Dave Black earlier talked about the medevac and, some very important communication needs that are, in these situations, life or death. So these super critical aspects of your communication system, yes, like there is a sense to talking about sovereignty for those, but I think it really lies in where differentiating basically what is that critical component that you need to own and retain control over, and what else can be delegated and should be delegated to the commercial sector.
That's cool. So Jake, you're based out there in the Asia Pacific, and traditionally that was like every nation wanted its own satellite back in the
Yes.
day, and you know it meant a lot. You know,
Part of the national identity.
yeah, you've got your flag up there in space. You know, are you seeing the same thing out there with the satellites and the all those systems? They do want a national thing, or because I can't see them.
They are. I mean, there's a few. Obviously, you know, Singtel, you know, has its own satellite constellations. Malaysia has MEASATs, and they have their identities there. I think they're going to struggle. I mean, I think the likes of what we're seeing with Starlink and also Kuiper belts, even some of the regional ones, you know, it's going to become extremely challenging for them. I mean, I think for them to, you know, unless they run a very subsidized type model and keep all the national interests, perhaps for government agencies, perhaps the military forces, they just want to make sure they've got a full end-to-end stack to support national vested interests, then okay, but it's going to have to be probably subsidized. There may be commercial alternatives that could run the service at a much lower price.
I think we heard earlier about the small geos, which again have been sold as a solution to the sovereignty option. You know, is that going to be enough? And I think that was going to be the cost of the ground segment going to be quite a bit because you have got to have more on the ground.
Well, speaking on Jake's subject there, I had a very interesting investigation of Taiwan's fascination with their own satellite capability. I'm sure if they could reasonably afford it, they would love their own constellation. But what they were saying was that however we can get there, however we can patchwork together, and it's for the best that we have so many providers, so we're not relying on one party, which would be a disaster, they believe. I think that...
So they spread the risk over a couple of constellations.
That was their idea, and indeed that came from government officials that were not affiliated with the industry. It was just, obviously, that had come down from whatever sort of chain of command, that the thought process obviously filtered through the government to that extent. But a lot of smaller nations are taking small geo very seriously. They think that that's sort of the solution. It's far cheaper, it's far more practical. And it suits really the needs that they can conceivably look for: disaster prevention, smaller topics. I don't know if it's really going to hold up to complicated military operations, but hopefully they won't have need of that. It's something to sort of represent that they are in this race, that they take it seriously, and that they are participating in the space domain, as there is a sort of continued rush into this space for governments to prove, look, we're paying attention to this, we have spend for this, and we're not going to be left behind.
Yeah, sorry, just to bounce back on that, I think Taiwan is an excellent example. You've seen their investment in their satellite with Astranis, the Chunghwa Telecom one, in addition to the partnership with OneWeb as a way to really bolster, in the end, ensured access, which is, in a way, what matters here for them. So I think that's a very compelling use case, indeed.
Did they have a joint venture with Singtel, or they on Singtel satellite?
I'm not aware.
Sure.
Possibly.
I think many just need to lean into HAPS. I mean, it's starting to happen. I think again was raised as a topic, I think by Andrew Sutton. I think high altitude platforms where, you got that in your back pocket. If you lose access to your satellites, or the more the commercial applications, you can put up your own aerofoils, and they can cover a good amount of the country, good amount of capacity, and then at least you've got some scenarios of coverage there.
I mean, that's a very interesting point. It's certainly a cost-effective one. I think that its redundancy is always valuable in these kinds of conversations. I think that there's probably a lot about HAPS that we have yet to discover that will provide a sort of best of breed for all kinds of markets who aren't, are capable of paying an arm and a leg for the most advanced satellite constellations. I don't think it should be the case that every country has its own constellation. It's insane. The globalized mentality sort of suits space very well, because these satellites are over every country. In a perfect world, there would be one constellation. So the sovereign angle there is very chaotic, and it contributes to this congestion in orbits. Everyone wants their own specific process, you have the maximal amount of data and congested orbits imaginable. And we're probably going to see the results of that giant push in a few short years.
Yeah, I think there's various different, kind of designs of these constellations out there. And if we look at something like the NTT option, what's the name of the
Space Mobile?
Space Compass.
No, Space Compass. Space
Yeah.
Compass, yeah.
So you have the GEO, you have the LEO, you might even have a VLEO in there. And then you have the HAPS, then you have your drones, then you have your ground segment and stuff. So they're kind of splitting the risk across a lot of dimensions there. Now they want to roll that out worldwide, just like Kuiper rolls out their system, just like Starlink's rolling out theirs. So there's going to be some different opportunities there for companies to try and, grab hold of it and, call it their own. But it's still going to be a sovereign system apart from Japan, really. And but there is going to be competition in the market, I think. So, and I like the idea of the HAPS. That does give you a good solution for the thing. So, do you think the Kuiper, the SailSat in China?
SailSat, I mean, that's very much for there's initiatives there trying to push back against some of the more global American sort of systems. They've got some challenges. I think I raised that on my sort of talk. I think they've got a lot of momentum, but I think the challenge is, unless they develop a very strong domestic market to butt up what they're trying to do, then they'll have some challenges trying to get into global market. And in terms of SpaceX, Starlink, it's been able to get a strong domestic market in North America, and then it's pushing into other markets. Whereas in China, though, we've always believed, 5G is fantastic, we've got 5G coverage, we don't really need sort of satellite. They're starting to change that point of view, but they just can't run the service externally without any sort of domestic support, I feel. But again, it's just multiple players, and I think China does like to spin a lot of competition, and let's see who's last person standing. They do this in the automotive space. You've got sort of BYD and Geely and so forth, and eventually some will fall by the wayside, but who's left is super competitive.
This is what's so useful about having people like Jake at these kinds of shows. He's well aware of the Chinese situation, which is very uncommon in this industry, I would say. It's true that they're trying a lot of remarkable things. Some of those big tech projects are coming down from government. They mentioned something around a AI cloud constellation a while back, which I covered, and space solar project to create massive amounts of energy that they were going to beam down. It's very ambitious because some of these technologies are at the very cutting edge, and it might all be, pomp and circumstance, but they said they were going to build a very advanced space station, and they did that. So I don't think that you can really call what they're saying a bluff. And that's another excellent point, that there is a growing private sector there, which is utilizing the power of competition, that is coming up with very interesting, innovative solutions. And it may well be the case that as they start looking to the markets immediately surrounding them, perhaps most so in Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries, they'll find people very willing to work with them and absorb market share that a lot of Western companies have recognized and gotten very excited about, assuming that this is sort of like completely free and for the taking for their marketers. Who knows if they will be too successful in that?
Yeah, it's interesting to look at what China's doing indeed. I think, in the beginning it was a little bit hard to differentiate what was just planning, what was going to actually happen. They had competing, the federal project, Guowang, you had the, Shanghai-sponsored space sail. I think we've seen Guowang ramp up quite a lot the past few months. Since August, I think they've launched something like 6 times. So they're really ramping up their launch cadence. They've put quite a number now of satellites into orbit, and I think it just proves how serious they are about that. The space sail project, from what I understood, was more focused on commercial capabilities. But yeah, definitely an interesting player. It is a very difficult market to understand. We have a special expert, Blaine Kershaw, who's specialized on China and who helps us out a lot with those types of questions.
Our friend Blaine also has a good knowledge on the China market. I think Malaysia was a good one because they've actually bought some, access to the Chinese Salesat along with the Starlink as well, as has Brazil, I think.
Even Starlink, Starlink is also in the country, so they're mixing up their options. And for many of these countries, that's the priority. As much as they're concerned about sort of sovereignty and being locked out, for many of these countries, the priority is just development of the economy, development of services for the domestic market, and that the price has got to be right for them, and they want that competition.
And we heard from the MOD earlier today where, previously, I think, the ground segment would have been mainly in here, and, basically the data wouldn't touch anywhere apart from UK. I don't think he didn't say that, but I'm pretty sure that's the way it used to be. And then, we heard about putting data links in overseas, in a weather kind of ground segment in Portugal or something in Spain, something in So that's moving away from sovereignty, but he's getting a better risk level. He's losing the risk. He doesn't have to lose this teleport here. He can go to that one, he can go to that one, to that one.
I think there's another aspect we need to consider in terms of sovereignty angle is the indirect, what I'm just going to call the indirect hostile act. So we're talking about paranoia. I want my data safe and I want my satellites to be safe. But there is issues, obviously, we didn't really touch too much upon PNT, positioning, timing, and navigation, these type of services. I mean, GPS has been the grandfather of all this, and there's Galileo. But when Galileo was being spun up, there was a lot of concern by the American stakeholders that, hey, this could be used against our interests, and eventually came to an agreement that Galileo could be dialed down in terms of accuracy in certain situations. But now we've got also commercial networks who've got their own PNT services. And clearly, in some places, there are challenges in Ukraine and other parts of the world where there's been jamming and blocking of sort of GPS signals, so having alternatives is advantageous, but some of the signals can be then used to then guide drones to attack an airport of a friendly power. And you say, wait, why is your network being used, PNT network being used to attack my assets in my country? So there's going to be some challenges there as well.
Yeah, PNT underpins so much. We don't necessarily understand how much it powers in our modern world. If it all disappeared one day, it would affect a lot more than I think a lot of us realize. And it has, there's so much that has dual use these days. This is what's so fascinating to European procurers. They want to buy up as much of these sort of space infrastructure powers that have military applications as they can after releasing this debt break. Complete change. You were mentioning at the top of this, Kevin, the reversal of the sort of globalization initiative into suddenly onshoring everything. It's sort of the opposite ideology to it we've always known. Germany spending a lot and being fiscally far less responsible. It's boggles the mind.
How about, we heard, it's on the agenda again, and we hear about it in the news buzzing around, is data centers in space, or data centers on the moon, putting secure, facilities where you wouldn't really expect them out there. Do you feel that's a sovereign play?
It might be sovereign. I think there's still some major issues with that solution. I mean, I think a lot of data centers, the key issue is latency. In terms of getting sort of traffic in and out of a data center is quite crucial. I think Laurence may be a better expert than I am on this, but and then heat exchange. I mean, I think, on Earth, you basically suck vast amounts of water out of rivers or lakes or sea to cool down these places. But in space, you think it's just above zero, but ultimately it's about it radiating the heat. You can't sort of take away the heat very easily from data centers. So there are some technical issues and maintenance and so forth. But you might provide more points of view.
Yeah, unfortunately, I could talk about this for a terrific amount of time working for Data Center Dynamics. Reported on it yesterday. So the conversation around last week, Jeff Bezos mentioned, I think it was to Reuters, that orbital data centers would outpace the terrestrial alternative within 10 to 20 years because of their, terrific access to solar energy, because of this principle around the ability to cleanly radiate heat. I think that there's a lot of fine print there to working that out completely. And more specifically, there's a terrific security question, because data centers have, perimeters, they have extensive security retinues, they have to have very important people looking at them, not necessarily remotely commercial, understanding that this hub of information is secure and that people can't just walk in and out, that people go through security checkpoints. This is very regimented. And the sort of loose principle that because you can't physically go to space somehow equals safety is very, very, vague.
Visual robots and...
Precisely. By then, it could well be the case that OTVs are capable of, in very, very advanced terms, manipulating machinery. We've seen orbital servicing occur. We've seen a satellite have parts exchanged out of it by Northrop Grumman some years ago. There's no reason to assume that's going to ever stop happening. But to a greater extent, I once heard that the space domain is the cyber domain, because there's no other method of interacting with these satellites. They're up there, they're going to be up there. The principle of retaining the satellite somehow is remarkably advanced. Deorbiting it without destroying it is an incredible overtaking. It would be like landing a man on the moon. It would be very complicated procedure. Perfectly possible, but very expensive and completely impractical. Which means that the way of interacting with these satellites is through cyber. And if someone gets all of the, control over the satellite, and you lose the ability to turn it off remotely, then they have it. And the difficulty with an orbital data center is that instead of having this massive constellation of tens of thousands of satellites, in which no particular one is an incredibly juicy target, it's entirely aggregated over massive stretches of space, you just have one that has all of the information running through it that could easily be destroyed or perhaps even more nefariously co-orbited. We're getting into sort of the weeds here, but the proposition that certain reputable people have been made at these kinds of conferences is that a co-orbiting satellite might be tuned into the same frequencies as the one that it's shadowing, receiving the same information. That's a big if, but I think it's a reasonable supposition, even if there's a 10% possibility that that's what China is doing effectively, or has an aspiration to eventually do. It should be taken very seriously, much as we all do with quantum and QKD. If it's possible, we should take it seriously. So that's far too many ifs for an orbital data center for me. If there's no way of reasonably securing it, and indeed this might well be answered with space stations, when you actually do have someone there who can pull the plug out. That was how we sort of riposted the cyber attacks with M&S and such. You just got, IT support lumbered in there and just pull the plug out. That you just put an end to it, and then they can go back from there. You can't deal with it with satellite. Perhaps it's something that should be relegated to manned space stations for that specific reason.
So how many actual national sovereign systems do you feel there's out there? Who can afford them without having to go with those commercial aspects?
Many. True intrinsic or end-to-end type players. I don't know, 10, 20. I haven't done a count. You only told me 20 minutes before. I have time to do the count, but I don't know, perhaps.
But with the multi-orbit layered system, there isn't going to be many.
Yeah, I think they really lean into the encryption angle. Perhaps quantum computing does challenge things, but you can create quantum safe systems. You can use optical links and sort of detect if someone's trying to sort of sniff on your data. I think that's going to be required. I think you have to presume that, the enemy is already within the system. In the early days, people would say, the governments wanted access to telecom networks until they realized actually many sort of third-party state actors are already in the system. So highly recommend and use WhatsApp, more reliable, robust, encrypted end-to-end software systems. That's going to just become the de facto mean, I feel.
I do worry this leaves the sort of remit of sovereignty, but yes, those are huge conversations. As an aside, I feel like, as someone who's attended a quantum conference, I feel like it's important to clarify that scientists have clarified it might not be real. Like hype men are very, very eager to put together this argument that this is an incredible technology, and if it exists, it is incredible. But holding a quantum state inside a computer is fantasy. Like they've managed to do it for very brief periods of time. They don't know why they're not able to sustain it. There's no obvious path forward in order to do better at this. They're researching it. I'm sure that there'll be incredible applications for it. There are many applications with quantum technologies. It very easily may not be quantum computing because it is such an advanced principle. It's no reason to assume that it won't, and it's to be taken seriously.
We'll have that as part of Irish Squared, won't we? The quantum as a quantum aspect being developed for. So, okay, I'm not going to take any questions whatsoever, but I am open to comment from the floor, and if you guys would like to join in. So, any comment from?
Do we have a mic?
For me, the simplest is sovereignty means as a government willing to give you some money towards a project you want to launch.
I don't think many governments can actually afford the full.
Or the other side of the argument is, in the future they may think they can't afford to be without such asset. Although in the 80s I even did the assessment for Mexico, and they were saying, should we do our own domestic satellite? And the conclusion was you do it for two reasons only. One is national pride, and the second was national security.
They're flying the flag over there as well.
Yes. I think the very least you can just shoot for reliable access to the connectivity you need, whether you can have full security and end-to-end, everything locked down. I think that's probably impossible. We had an inquiry recently saying, well, in terms of smartphones, are there any sort of phones which are used for sort of defense scenarios? As well, and in terms of like a military or defense type smartphone, I'm not really aware of any. There are ruggedized phones, but when you look at ruggedized phones, most of them are actually Chinese now. There was Nokia, but Nokia was with HMD. You could argue whether HMD is really a European company or not. And even they've separated. There's Samsung, and then there's Apple. Actually, Apple, is very rugged. I mean, it's got a ceramic shield top and back, but it's very, very expensive. So in terms of a completely locked down device which belongs to one sovereign state, it's probably China. So.
I had that discussion years ago with OneWeb, and they said, we're going to do our own smartphone for use with our satellites. And I said, but you're doing something that isn't within the chipset of the phones. It'll be too expensive. And their response was, but it'll be attractive to somebody because it'll be more secure.
Marketing hype.
Liz?
Just a comment on the data centers in space. There are actually several companies who are looking at doing this and using optical links to take it down to the ground from a security point of view. And also going back historically, when I looked at this years ago in some other application, actually the big users were going to be the financial services who wanted that complete security to downlink things exactly where they wanted it, not where it might happen to come down to the ground and then transmit through.
It might be easier just to put a data center in the ocean, and if you want to put it beyond the borders of a particular country, and that.
They walked away.
Yeah, sorry. Microsoft looked into that a while ago, and then stopped the research on it and started looking in space.
Not surprised.
Roger Patrick from Terma. I come back to the definition of what sovereignty really means, and I remember two examples from the 1990s or late 90s in space. When Galileo was first mooted, Bill Clinton said, "We've turned off selective availability. Why do you need to build Galileo?" And a lot of people said, because you can turn it off, you can also turn it back on. That's why we need Galileo. And the second thing was during the Balkans conflict, where the Americans suspected someone of leaking intelligence data, so the NATO sharing of imagery was suddenly stopped for a period. And I think in terms of, you had a definition of sovereignty going down the supply chain. I think it's really those more real-time, truly operational decisions where sovereignty in space is what sovereignty in space means.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's when there's a national situation, you want to make sure you've got the resources you need to be able to affect your strategy.
Anyone else? Any more comment? Okay. Would you like to give a little takeaway comment for our audience?
We'll probably still be discussing this topic again next year, so see you all then for another nuanced and complex discussion.
If you solve it, just let us know.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I have a lengthy point to make. Perhaps I'll curtail it, but I think that the big sort of argument that I have around sovereignty is that if we really take this seriously and really onboard everything and really only trust ourselves, it really creates a kind of feedback loop in terms of the geopolitical environment. If we don't have the question, can we trust X, Y, Z anymore, we decide that we can't, how are we ever going to sort of change that trust environment? If we already believe the bridge is burning, who's going to start rebuilding it? You know, it sort of creates an echo chamber of distrust that I think can be very unhealthy. So I think that there ought to be more of a conversation around what can we trust with each other? How can we move back to this position of not being fearful of one another?
Sort of feel that sovereignty is really a collaborative process. You can't do it on your own. You better choose your friends very wisely, build that trust, keep the relationship, hopefully for long term, hope there's no changes in government, and maintain it, I would say.
Yeah. Alix, Laurence, I forgot your name, Jake. There for a second.
That's all right.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for staying around and having a little bit of fun.